Greetings, everybody, and welcome to another TenX Strategies webinar where we go deeply into the weeds in a topic related to fundraising and marketing for your nonprofit organization that can hopefully help you really 10x your fundraising over the long term, either by increasing the number of donors giving, but perhaps more importantly, how they're giving and how they're helping you advance your mission. And we've got a great topic today. Today on the calendar, October 1st, the first day of the fourth quarter of 2024. How should you be thinking about the end of the year? A lot of us, I've been there, sometimes it's sometime after Thanksgiving, like, wow, what should we be doing at the end of the year? And frankly, for a lot of things that you could be doing, that's just too late. It might even be a little too late now, believe it or not. But anyway, we're going to show you a path forward on how you can really make some improvements to your fundraising this year that could show and should show some positive results. I'm really pleased to have with me John Davis. John is the Vice President for Growth at the Leadership Institute. John has been there for 19 years and has really done a remarkable job over that professional span that he's had, going from helping out at the margins and some fundraising to leading some extraordinary growth. Really fits into the whole 10x and going big mindset and approach. So, John, I want to kick this over to you. And if you could, just for the benefit of our audience today, what is the Leadership Institute? What is its mission?
Sure. Thank you, Kevin. Grateful to be here with you. The Leadership Institute trains strong conservative leaders for our country. And our operating assumption is that there are many problems that our country is facing right now that would be solved if we had more leaders or better leaders. And so if we can create more conservative leaders and make the ones that we have better, conservatives are going to do a lot better in doing something that you've talked about, which is demonstrating the will to win.
Awesome. Well, tell us a little bit about what is the estimated revenue for Leadership Institute this year, and how many donors are actively giving?
Well, we've grown a lot in the last few years. Estimated revenue this year will be around $45 million, and there will probably be about 120,000 or so donors who contributed to make up for that. A lot of really great people.
Well, that's extraordinary. John, you and I were talking a moment ago, and of course, I worked at the Leadership Institute many years ago, and I remember that big moment we crossed the $1 million threshold for annual revenue at some point in December. So that's extraordinary. It can be intimidating to a lot of organizations to hear that kind of a big number. Like, well, how can my $2 million or $5 million or $500,000 organization possibly be appropriate to learn from the lessons and insights you're about to share? But just for perspective, give us a sense for where Leadership Institute has come in just to say last 5, 8, 10 years in terms of revenue and number of donors giving.
Sure. Well, Kevin, one of my formative moments in fundraising, I remember I had started working around 2010 or so about 14 years ago. And we were $6 or $7 million that year. And somebody, I came in who worked for the Heritage Foundation, and I was like, "You're the Heritage Foundation. We could never do anything like what you did." And he said, "Well, hold on here. These are proven techniques. The only difference is Heritage Foundation started earlier. And if you really tried and you focused and you began to systematically do the things that Morton's telling you to do, you're going to be able to grow up over time." And, Kevin, that vision really matters. And we know that when we're talking to donors, that laying out a vision matters. And I thought, really? Is that true? And so we tried, and, learning from men like Morton Blackwell, learning a lot from you, Kevin, and then applying, as we came to understand more, applying those has helped the Leadership Institute grow a lot. So if we were $6 million in 2010, we had grown up to about $20 million, which we were very proud of by the time we got to 2020. And then Morton Blackwell, our president, said, for the moment that we're in, we need to go all in and seek to double our revenue so we can double our programs because of the moment we're in. And I thought that was a little bit aggressive at the time, but here we are. We went from 20 million to 28 million to 39 million to 42 million last year. And then it's Q4, so we'll see what this year brings, but we're definitely way ahead of last year as well.
Well, that's extraordinary and congratulations. And there's so much that we could talk about in this vein, but today we're going to focus more on first a question: how does Leadership Institute think about fundraising generally? How do you approach it from both philosophical and a strategic sense?
You know, that's a great question. Above all, we seek understanding. And I've come spending years as a tip subscriber and hearing your advice over time, learning from Morton Blackwell, Richard Viguerie, other mentors. I've come to appreciate that there is no one size fits all. You can be moderately successful as a fundraiser if you just do what your organization has always been doing. You'll probably get about the same results. And because people don't want to be involved with fundraising, they'll say, "That's great. You handled the fundraising for us." What better fundraisers do is they look around at other organizations and they look at what have become kind of the best practices. What are the things that organizations that are growing do? And then they seek to bring those practices into their organization. And that usually helps you grow as well. And that's a good approach. One of the ways that our approach is developed at the Leadership Institute is we've come to value going one step further. And we really come to believe that the best fundraisers don't just adopt best practices, but they seek to understand the forces and the dynamics that govern their fundraising so that they can apply them in ways that are custom and unique to the donors they're working with, to the mission of their organization. And when you do that and you apply that sort of intensity, your fundraising results just take off and you can achieve things that would simply be impossible without doing that. And so that's the approach that we seek to take.
Well, that's a terrific approach. Well, how do you think about fundraising at the end of the year in the fourth quarter? What differentiates how you think about fundraising now versus how you think about fundraising generally?
Well, happy Q4, day one. It is the most important time of the year. It's the time that most of the giving is going to happen. It's a time that's going to set the trajectory for our organization in the future. It's a time that both staff and donors are feeling a heightened sense of awareness and reflection. And so there are two powerful forces that we look at that seem to uniquely apply at the end of the year. And so we're always in all of our fundraising seeking to understand who the donors are and where they overlap with our mission, and then seek to persuade them to see where that overlap is so that we can grow. But at the end of the year, it just happens to be with donors that because of the seasons and their history, there are two things that are unique. And the first of those is the power of nostalgia, which is something that you've talked about for a long time. I know, Kevin, you send out in your tips emails every year, you have a wonderful series leading up to Thanksgiving where people tell meaningful stories from their lives. And I look forward to that every year. Simply at working kind of at a meta level, not only is nostalgia great, but I'm already anticipating in my heart what's coming down the road. And that's something natural about that time of the year. Unlike the middle of the year when people have other distractions, people tend to turn inward then. Nostalgia is not a looking back. It's a remembering of the great things that have happened so that we can have a positive and grateful vision of the future. And when people look back to thinking about their families, when people look inward in moments of spiritual reflection, it's a moment where religious services turn our eyes upward. They open up our hearts, and people are think deeply about the traditions that they've inherited and what their identity is. And for many people, they say, I feel like I ought to be the sort of person who enters into these traditions. And part of that tradition in America, in the West, in a Christian society, in a kind of the Christian West philosophically, part of that tradition is a tradition of giving. And so that opens up modes of communication that might feel unnatural at other points of the year, but are deeply moving to people. So that's the first one. And that changes and impacts the messaging, our conversations that are available for us to have with donors, how we can advance relationships where we otherwise might not be able to. The second one is there's a human desire to close out the year. When you're coming to the end of something, it forces decisions. It brings things to a head. And we see this, for example, just separate from what we do with our fundraising. It so happens that we have an unusually large number of bequests at the end of the year. And the reason that we have an unusually large number of bequests has nothing to do with when people are passing away. It has to do with the fact that tax attorneys don't want to have to, if they don't finish the process by the end of the year, they're going to have to do a whole new set of forms for next year. And so that great mover of the human heart, the IRS, has a way of sharpening the mind. And suddenly you get to the last week or two of the year, and a lot of things that have been hanging out there get closed out. That's also true in our relationships with donors. There are donors who may have been on an individual level considering a major gift, and we've talked about it, and they say, I need to talk to my wife, and I need to reflect on it, and I need to pray about it. But when they get to the end of the year, both if they're making it with some consideration of IRS implications, that forces an issue. But even if they weren't, even if they're not, they're going to be feeling a sense of wanting to close that part of their life out so they can begin again new in the new year. That means that we can talk to them differently, and we can have conversations that would be harder to have at other points in the year.
Well, thanks. That's a great way to put it. And by the way, I was reminded yesterday by one of our tip subscribers that for our subscribers who are Jewish, Rosh Hashanah, we're right now at that time, and that is another similar time that they can engage in that spirit of giving as well. So you can think about this in a similar way with all the respects to different religions and cultures as well, obviously. But I think that's the way you describe that. We all need a deadline. We need that sense of urgency at time. It focuses our mind. It's a great way to put it. John, tell us about the honey mailing. What is the honey mailing? Give us a little bit about the history of it, and then walk us through what happens today, or what will happen in 2024.
Well, let me start by saying that we are right now in the middle of production to send out 80,000 jars of honey. And this is mind-blowing to me. This is not something that I ever expected that I was going to be in the honey business. Here's what it looks like going on right now. And it's interesting how we got there because honey doesn't seem like it would have much to do with a nonprofit. It's turned out to be one of the most important, crucial, and significant moments of our year. But it didn't start out that way. And it didn't start out as a fundraising technique. What happened was our president, Morton Blackwell, raised bees. That's authentically what he did. And a few years in a row, he had more honey than he knew what to do with. And so he started bringing it to parties to give away to friends. And then he still had more honey than he knew what to do with. And the Leadership Institute was growing at that point. And so he sent it out to a few of the major donors to the Leadership Institute just as a way to say thank you. Well, the next year came along, and he noticed that he kept getting notes back from those donors saying, Morton, I'm sending in my check, and I so appreciated the honey. And everybody, he felt like in his head was right, we're writing larger checks, and there were more people who were continuing to support the Leadership Institute. And so he said, I feel like maybe I should do it again and see what happens. And so he sent it out again the next year to a few more people, and began to measure and to test and to see how it worked. And what he found was that it created a deeply meaningful moment. It was a way for him to tap into the nostalgia that people felt. It was a way to connect authentically with the mission of the Leadership Institute, because he always talks about their partnership between what LI is trying to accomplish and the role they've played in the context of the holidays, and engendered such a closer relationship with people that there was more giving over time.
Well, John, it's also probably useful to point out that from a standpoint, in fact, I think it's mentioned in Vigory's 4 Horsemen of Marketing, that when you have to cut through the clutter, a jar of honey stands out at holiday time when donors, generally are very generous with a lot of organizations. Most donors are giving to 30, 40 organizations or more. And how do they really know the difference between the Institute for X, Y, and Z and the Center for A, B, and C, et cetera? But that honey sure does stand out. That's a hole in the marketplace that you all have grabbed, and it certainly is an element of Morton's and the Leadership Institute's brand. Well, I have some other questions related to this, and I also want to get into details about how you think about organizing your team, staff resources, just everything with respect to being ready for this time of the year. And you can reclaim this. We'll want to look back at you as we're speaking to you, John. How should other organizations think about the lessons from the honey mailing? And by the way, you said 80,000 jars. Does that go to everybody who contributes or who's ever contributed? Who does that go to?
That's a good question, and we put a lot of thought into. What we do is, and this is normal for fundraising practices, is we find something that we think is working, and then we begin to test it. And so over time, we've tested, and you can look at donors who are giving $1,000, and if some of them get honey and some of them don't get honey, the ones who get honey are going to give more, and not only give more, but give enough to make up for that difference. As you work down, it's not going to make sense to send honey to something like a $10 donor, because you're going to use up their entire donation, and they will let you know that you're using up their entire donation on a jar of honey. And so over time, we've tested into what we feel like is where a return on investment is honoring of the donors' gifts that they've given to us. It's good stewardship.
All right, just a few more particulars. So, and you mentioned the start of this. I remember when I was at Leadership Institute a long time ago, we had a local Boy Scout troop who put together the honey. It was about 1,000 of them, and then what we paid them to get it done, I think they used for their annual camp away out of town or something like that. So it's obviously grown a lot. Not to get into all the production now, purchasing the honey and the jars and things, but how do you think about the idea of the letter, what the letter says? What are you trying to impart? And again, how should others think about that? You obviously have to start now because you can't get 80,000 jars of honey into the postal system or through UPS in a few days. But how should others think about this?
So there's two parts to that. One, with the honey, we start early on in the year. It just happens to be at that scale, and we've learned we got out of Virginia honey into North Dakota honey into Montana honey, and Morton always communicates that in the letter, and that's because it's important. The authenticity of the connection is the thing that makes it work. It's not that I sent you something. If I sent you something, it will work to some extent, because we know that reciprocity works and people will feel an obligation to give more. But what you want to do is to foster an authentic connection between the donor and the organization. And the more real that is, the better it is. We do tune our messaging at the end of the year. We know, Kevin, you've talked about the von Mises model of human action, as if you want somebody to act, you have to meet three conditions. You have to tell me if I've got this right. But one is there has to be a discontent with the current state of affairs. There has to be a vision of a better state, and there has to be a belief in a credible path to get there. And that's where the Leadership Institute sits. How'd I do?
Yep, that's pretty good. So you've got the honey mailing, which is a thank you mailing.
Yes.
I believe you now include a business reply envelope with an express purpose, not necessarily seeking other contributions, but people will utilize that at that moment they get the honey to send some contributions in. Tell us about that, and also how you think about the final 3 months of the year with respect to prospecting, the nature of your house file solicitations, anything else that you're doing proactively, we'll say in seeking additional support. And then I want to talk after that about how you're reacting to the moment as well.
Sure. So when we come into the last 3 months of the year, our messaging shifts. We talk less about how terrible things are. You always have to have some discontent with the current state of affairs. If you're going to connect around a mission, there has to be a reason to do that mission. We talk more about what has been accomplished, and people are reflective and looking back on their years. We want to be part of their reflection and how they look back and think of the charities they've supported. Ideally, all of the communications go together, and ideally they're telling a story of progress. What we're doing right now this month is probably more aggressive because we're a month out from a time when many conservatives are working for causes and candidates of their choice, and it's going to be a defining moment in the lives of donors. They're going to have an emotional reaction to how they feel about whatever happens in November. And so we want to prepare for that. That doesn't happen every year. As we move closer into the holidays, I learned this from Rick Hendricks, who's somebody that you and I think both benefited from his wisdom. Often, Rick said, as you get towards the end of the year, you want to talk a little bit about the future, but you have an opportunity to talk about everything that's been accomplished and all of the good that's been done. And the reason why you want to do that is you want to be in somebody's mind when they're in that period of reflection to develop a long-term value. You want them to be thinking of you as, this was a good investment. This is a credible group. This is a good path to future success and what I want to do. The honey taps into that. And there's more than the honey, and how I would apply that is unique to the organizations. I know, Kevin, I mentioned to you, I was really impacted by a similar outreach from Hillsdale College. I got in my mailbox last year, and I think it's a good practice for most fundraisers to give to other organizations, partly because character is formed through action. And when you enter into giving, you begin to understand how others think about giving as well. And so I gave to Hillsdale College, and I got in my mailbox an adorable little ornament. It was a punch-out ornament. If the execution had not been done with as much thought, it may have felt cheap. But the people who did this at Hillsdale College didn't say, oh, we're going to need to send something out, and if we send people something, they're going to feel better, and then they're going to give better. They really thought about, how do I connect, even with a paper ornament? How do I connect with the people who are going to get this? And so it was an adorable little punch out. It talked about the history of the college. It connected through the shared mission around the Christ Chapel, which is there on their college campus. And it evoked in me, I thought it was an interesting experience. And this is an experience, this is a little philosophical, but I think it's a good thing to reflect on. Because it will help us understand what we're aiming at to communicate with donors. And I began to think, as I got this, about my first contact with Hillsdale College, which was an imprimis sitting on my grandfather's table. And it reminded me of how much my grandfather had invested in me. And I found that I was happy to have something from Hillsdale. It gave me a mode to enter into a relationship with them. It activated something that was inside of me that wouldn't have activated if they hadn't sent it to me, or if I had just gotten another solicitation from them. And I felt like by giving to Hillsdale College, I could relive some of those memories that I had when I was younger. It made me think about Hillsdale's mission as a trustee of the Western philosophical and theological inheritance, which is something that I care about, and reminded me of why that's important for the future. All of that was powerful for communications at scale. Our lights go on and off. It's an adventure. So that's one part. And this is also what Honey does. It's a way to communicate with many of the donors, understanding many of their emotions at scale. One of the advantages we have as fundraisers is we also get to know donors as individuals. And following the 80-20 rule, often the largest donations, the donations that can 10x you're giving, the donations that can become transformational for an organization, are those that are developed through one-to-one communications with donors who want to invest deeply. And I thought it was interesting. I sent to a friend at Hillsdale College. I said, "Thank you for the ornament. I'm so moved." And he told me something I didn't know. He's like, "Oh, wow. Would you like the brass one?" He said, "Let me send you another ornament. There's a fancier brass one if you'd like it, and I'll send it to you at no charge for such a strong supporter of Hillsdale." And I felt so special in that moment, and it began to deepen the partnership. My affinity for Hillsdale. I now not only look at the ornament that I had, but I have a deeper personal connection because of that. And I realized that's something that we can foster, and that way and that means of communication, of really having a personal outreach, is a way that we can layer on top, speaking just in the same mode, our personal relationships as well. It's not
Thanks.
only, go ahead.
No, thanks, John. And I think, did you have an example? Did you have that example to share with folks? Can you share your screen, the image of the ornament? I've seen Mount Vernon recently had a similar punch out and a solicitation mailing they had. Groups that will do things like a calendar, things like that. Thanks. That's great. Well, let's get even more specific, and then we'll begin to wrap up, John. So first, going back to the honey mailing, you include a business reply envelope. Tell us about that. Why do you do that? Does that step on the gratitude that you're expressing, or what's your thinking there?
Right. So we include a business reply envelope, but we go out of our way not to ask for money in the mailing. And that's a principle that's come down from Morton. It is important. We believe that if you send somebody something that's a gift that's immediately asking for money, then what you're doing is it makes the gift inauthentic, and it's going to have less of an impact. However, we do, if donors in that moment of gratitude want to give, we want to provide them a means by which to do that. And so there's always a reason for us to ask for a relational reply in the honey mailing. So for example, we sent out a mailing a few years ago, and we said we'd like to put together a honey cookbook of recipes from you and other Leadership Institute donors. If you have a recipe, you can send that back in the envelope. And many people did. Many other people, along with their recipe or without the recipe, sent in checks and donations right away. The year later, we said, we've put together this honey cookbook from you and your fellow Leadership Institute donors. If you'd like a copy of the cookbook, let us know. Here, we put an envelope in for that reason. And that seemed to be a good way to provide a response device without actually asking for money, which would have undermined the nature of the relationship we were trying to foster.
All right. Well, I want to invite folks to ask questions in the Q&A. That's the most effective way to do it. But John, so this mailing goes out to land, what, roughly after Thanksgiving, before Thanksgiving, early December?
We try to send it out as close to Thanksgiving as possible.
And why is that? I remember when it was done in December. What's the thinking on doing it earlier?
Generally, what we found is that as people get into the holiday season, the franticness with which they're going to approach their daily lives is going to increase. And there's a benefit to being as early as possible as they're entering into the holiday season.
Okay. You all have a large, obviously, direct mail base. You're overwhelmingly a direct mail organization, but you utilize other means through major gifts as well as online. In terms of direct mail, and I'll get to the online in a minute, when do you make year-end solicitations? When roughly are you sending things where people will receive a request to contribute again?
So we're going to send it at the beginning of December. We generally send letters to donors once a month, and we send them as early to the start of the month as possible. So in the beginning of December, donors will get a letter, and it will talk about all of the people who they trained, some of the victories that they made possible, and we'll celebrate what was done this year and talk a little bit about where we're headed next year, and then ask them for a donation. That's our monthly house file. You then there's a special audience that you can reach in a special way at the end of the year. And those are donors who may not have renewed their support. And there are many donors themselves who think in calendar year cycles. And there are many donors, you just said, there are people who give to 20 or 30 organizations. They may have not given to you because they didn't remember that they hadn't given to you, but in some cases, they really are on the fence. And if you remind those donors, you've been giving to the Leadership Institute for 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 years, and I'm checking in with you because we haven't received your support this year, and that's okay. But you may not have realized that, and this is your chance before the year closes to maintain your streak.
All right. So you're sending a solicitation early October, early November, as well as early December. The honey mailing is hitting sometime mid to late November, early December. What about Giving Tuesday on December 3rd? How do you all approach that moment?
That's a great question, and worth doing a deep dive on. Giving Tuesday, we usually do a run-up like many other organizations. We do a run-up to that campaign. There are some donors who, for the social experience of being involved in Giving Tuesday, they like to give on that day. And so we'll talk in ways that align with the house file. We'll talk about the impact that their giving has made. And hopefully, if they're reading our mail, they're also going to get similar messaging in our online communications as well.
All right. How do you think about staffing at the end of the year? 30% of contributions for most charitable organizations arrive in December. That may not be matched entirely with Leadership Institute. I know you'll solicit throughout the year. Your annual appeal mailing you send in January and February is also very important. But a lot of giving occurs in just the final days. And I know of a number of nonprofits who shut down the last week of the year. How do you all think about that from the standpoint of staffing?
Well, Kevin, I grew up, my parents owned a small bookstore, and the idea of us shutting down in the middle of the Christmas season would have gotten, my dad would have had strong words for me if I had suggested that. It turns out that we work in a seasonal business, and there are part of how we serve donors, part of how we form the deepest connections is to put their needs first within appropriate boundaries. And so for the Leadership Institute, we tend to celebrate that last week of the year. The development staff are in, many of the program staff are not here at the Leadership Institute, and that's because there aren't a whole lot of people who are interested in political training in that week between Christmas and New Year's. But for development, this is the very most impactful week of the year. And this is a time for many donors where emotionally, not only are they trying to tie up their year, but they've just had family come and go and they're deeply reflective. And so if we weren't here on the phone, talking to folks, interacting with folks, able to take donations so they can get in by the 30th, we wouldn't be doing our jobs. That could be a grind, but it actually turns out to be a lot of fun. We do as much as possible. We have Christmas decorations and little Christmas celebrations during the day. And when the donations are coming in and you see what's possible, it can really bring a lot of joy.
So that's important. And I've got my own anecdotes of where somebody might want to make a year-end stock gift, particularly in a year like this when there's been so much extraordinary appreciation. People do give more when they feel richer on paper. And so there's likely to be a lot of activity. And I know plenty of stories of somebody who says, I was going to give $10,000 to organization X, but they never called me back. So I just went ahead and gave it to organization Y. Maybe because they just happened to get a prospect letter in the mail that day. We know that that's how this stuff works. So your recommendation is you've got to be fully engaged at the end of the year. And I mean, are you also doing thank you phone calls to some donors? How are you really thinking about all of those opportunities as people focus on that end of year?
Yeah, we have as many phone calls as possible, as much communication as possible. And I try to, we usually make up for it with the development staff. There are plenty of times in the year where we try to extend other vacations. We don't want to be Grinches, but the momentum that you can gain, the connections you can form, have an impact not just on the year-end giving that people have. We're on the phone as much as we absolutely can be, but they also have ways of forming relationships that carry into the next year, either through start of year donations or just simply the rhythms and routines of knowing that we're going to be together and we're going to be talking together at this time of the year regularly can impact. If somebody makes a commitment, it changes the entire trajectory of that relationship. And so we really have found outsized value there.
All right. Final question for you, John Davis, and that is how do you evaluate success for what you're doing at the end of the year? There's a tendency to do a lot of activity and say, well, we raised more money than last year. Everything we must have done must have worked. And whatever we hadn't done before or did before, it obviously didn't work as well. How do you evaluate success?
Well, Morton has trained us to focus on lifetime value. Above everything else, our goal is to increase the lifetime value of donors to the Leadership Institute, because we know if we can do that, we'll be able to expand programs in ways that we just wouldn't be able to. When we look at lifetime value, it breaks down into 4 components, and we look at our acquisition, which has less to do with this, but we also look at our renewal rates and conversion rates, which are one-time donors going to 2 or 2-time donors going to 3 or 4, and then our upgrade rates. And that's where we're always going to raise a lot of money in Q4, but paying attention to, are the donors who categorically should be renewing, are the donors who've given to us 10 times before, staying with us at the same rate. Are the donors who were brand new last year, joining and renewing at the same rate, is usually the best indicator that we find. And the reason that that's helpful is sometimes those things happen in different periods of the year. And there are things you can do like matching grants that will artificially displace revenue, but it washes out by the time you get to the end of the year. And so that's where we usually take close stock, and we measure and evaluate broadly as an organization on our lifetime value metrics. Secondary to that, we have an evaluation that we do of particular mailing projects, and that includes the honey mailing, where we take a look at if we're going to invest in something like that, what is the long-term impact of that? And this is what we found. So let me explain to you this chart that I've just put up on my screen. What this shows is a single group of donors who we sent honey to back in 2014. And when we sent honey to this group of donors, we split them up so that half of them got honey and half of them didn't get honey. And then we asked over time, what's the long-term impact of this going to be? So as you can see on here, I started this chart back in 2012. It is a way to make sure that we really were dealing with like populations. And you'll see that they stayed essentially the same up until the end of 2014 when they began to split. And the interesting thing is that over the next year, from 2015 to 2016, the value per donor that we had for those who got honey was very different from those who didn't. And that kind of split A/B test is the gold standard. It's the best way that you can evaluate a particular action. Here's the really interesting thing. These are two groups of people, Kevin, who are exactly identical. We changed nothing. Nothing changed except one decision one time in 2014 to either send them honey or not send them honey. And yet you'll notice that as the years go by, the gap, not only have we built a gap there, but the gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger as you move down towards the end. And so what we've discovered is that that single decision, because of the impact in the relationship and ultimately in how it impacted the likelihood of donors to bond with the organization and to stay with the organization, continues to generate new dollars 10 years later.
That's amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that. And presumably you continue to do a lot of other analysis like that as well. I did have one question in the Q&A that is directed at you, and that is, when you're thinking about the message of your year-end solicitation, how do you balance talking about sort of retrospectively the accomplishments related to the mission versus perhaps you have a new special project or initiative? Do you mention both? Do you ever test one over the other? How do you make the decision of what to highlight? Or do you just generally at the end of the year just stick with more of a retrospective, thank you for what you've helped us achieve, looking ahead to the next year?
Well, you have to ask for something. If there's no reason for someone to give, they're not going to. Although uniquely at the end of the year, they will give more for the sake of being part of your institution. The answer to the question depends on the organization, the project, the timing, what you can say authentically. I would always, it's less of an issue of which should be present. Both should be present. It's a question of emphasis. And unless, if it's December 2020 and you're a political campaign and the balance of the Senate, which is going to determine what Biden can accomplish or not accomplish, hangs in the balance on what's happening in Georgia, then you probably go in all in on that message because there's an authentic urgency to it. If you're looking to just plan ahead for next year, I would steer away from saying, here's our big new project right now at the beginning of December, because you're not going to be meeting donors quite where they're at. Most people, as they move into the new year, there's a reason why people do New Year's resolutions at the start of the year. And it's a universal phenomenon as people are planning out, what are the big new things that I want to be part of? They're emotionally going to be more open to those sorts of proposals early in January. And so what we do is we kind of flip it. So in December, we're mostly talking about what's been accomplished, what we've done together, why they should be proud of being part of the Leadership Institute, and a little bit of what could be done ahead and why it's so important to continue. In January, we're talking a lot more about, look at these, like a couple paragraphs. We accomplished great things together last year. That was really great. But let's look at this year and the opportunities that are there, and where Morton really lays out his vision for the organization, what could be accomplished if we were to stretch and to embrace new things. And I think that's a formula that for most nonprofits, unless there's something unique about what you're doing, is probably the right approach to meet a donor emotionally where they're at.
Well, great. Well, thanks. Well, John Davis, thanks for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, I think some of the key summary items to consider is to step back at this moment. How do you think about fundraising for your organization? How do you think about your donors? How should you think about it differently this time of the year? Is there an opportunity to mix in elements of appropriate gratitude that's tied to Thanksgiving as well as the end of the year? Is there an opportunity to tie that to elements of nostalgia when that tends to be most applicable this time of the year? How do you cut through the clutter? How are you thinking about the frequency of solicitation, whether it's direct mail or online or whatever it is you're doing? Are you sort of playing under the net? Are you ready from the standpoint of staffing to be there to accept things not only that come in the mail, but phone calls and other inquiries that people are making and have questions related to the end of the year? And then also the question about segmentation, not looking at all of your donors the same, maybe those that generally give this time of the year but haven't. Are there some that you need to reach out to? Are there other lapsed donors that you want to tweak the message a little bit and make it a little bit more pertinent to their own giving relationship to the organization? Lots of opportunities. We're going to join together again next week with Nathan Hill from Next After. He's going to go through a lot of techniques and tips related to online giving at this particular part of the year, as well as how they recommend you think about Giving Tuesday, which is on December 3rd. John Davis, thanks for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And just continue to think about how you can go big, because we all owe it to the people we're trying to help through our mission to have more resources to do more for all those people we're trying to help. All right. Thanks a lot. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.